So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Fireside Chats. I'm Pallavi Ade. Shreyas Deshmukh and I are the co-founders of Asian Pathfinders, and we're really uh, happy and welcome you today to today's edition because it's a very interesting topic and it's something I don't think gets enough attention. So we're really glad that Mr. Gautam Bhattacharyya, who is the Deputy Head of Mission at Embassy of Sweden, is joining us for this topic of to give us a brief about how Sweden conducts its feminist foreign policy. For the ones who do not know, Sweden is the pioneer of feminist foreign policy, and we'll give it to leave it to him to tell us more about it. Before that, a brief about Asian Pathfinders. So we started last year. We are a knowledge sharing platform. We are an open platform. We want to be a place where we can have constructive dialogues on multi-disciplinary topics from politics to economics to everything under the sun, I guess. But yeah, we also try to bridge scholars, practitioners, academics together. And we want to be an informal way for you to connect. So we always welcome feedback and ideas from the community. So please reach out to us. And about our upcoming sessions, so next Saturday, we have a session on the present state of left-wing extremism in India. I know a lot of you would know recently the ghastly attacks that took place in Chhattisgarh uh, uh, on the security forces in light of that, but to give us an overall situation. We have Mr. Girdhari Nayak, who is a former IPS officer, and Dr. P.V. Ramanna, who is a senior scholar on left-wing extremism in India, who will be speaking on this topic. And in, sorry about that. On 24th, we have the prospects of India's neighborhood first policy. We have Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon speaking on it. So just before we pass it on to Dnyanada for the proceedings, she'll be the moderator. Just the community guidelines, please stay on mute because we record these sessions, so we want to reduce the noise. Respect intellectual property and also respect the views of others. We all come from different walks of life. So, we all have different ideas and thoughts about the topic discussed, but I think we have to have a constructive discussion about it. So please do that. And if you do use any languages which is against the community guidelines, unfortunately, Shreyas or I would have to remove you. Please don't make us do that. We haven't done it so far, so please. And obviously, you can reach out to all of us. We can find us on social media. And just to give a brief about Dnyanada before I give it to her for the proceedings. Dnyanada is a policy researcher with experience in defense, foreign, and economic policy research and advising. She is currently the senior policy analyst at the Pune International Center, where she handles the national security vertical of the PIC. She also has interest in defense economics, political economy, international security, and public policy as well. And she has done a bachelor's in political science from Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and a master's is in IR from Sciences Po Paris. She has worked with the MPIDSA. She has worked with Delhi Policy Group. She has worked with numerous think tanks. So over to you, Dnyanada.
Thank you for that introduction, Pallavi. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us on a Saturday morning. This promises to be a very interesting session. What I will do is I will introduce our speaker, Mr. Bhattacharya, and then I will provide a very brief sort of couple of points on feminist foreign policy and the framework that it follows, and then I will hand it over to Mr. Bhattacharya. Mr. Bhattacharya is currently the Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Sweden in New Delhi. He is an economist by training, and he has previously served at the Swedish Embassy in Santiago de Chile from 2002 to 2004, and New Delhi from 2004 to 2008. He has also served in different departments of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Stockholm. He has worked briefly in public affairs consulting with Springtime AB from 2009 to 2010, and with Marivent Research from 2011 to 2013. In a nutshell, feminist foreign policy is a multidimensional policy framework which is centered around the well-being of marginalized and female groups. It uses gender equality as its guiding principle, and it lies at the core of the framework. Sweden, as Pallavi rightly pointed out before, is a pioneer of feminist foreign policy. And its conduct of feminist foreign policy is based on the 3 R's, which are rights, representation, and resources. The aim is to strive to strengthen the rights, representation, and access to resources for all girls and women based on the reality in which they live. And given that this is a practice of policy initiated by the former Swedish Foreign Affairs Minister Margot Wallström, I'm sure Mr. Bhattacharya will elaborate further and let us know how Sweden conducts its feminist foreign policy and operationalizes it. Over to you, Mr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Dnyanada, and please call me Gautam. Nice to be here with you all. Thank you for sacrificing. I see 43 people in the participating, so thank you for sacrificing your Saturday to listen to a Swedish bureaucrat. But first of all, thank you all for taking this initiative, and I'm really humbled also to see the stellar lineup of people that you have, Shiv Shankar Menon and others. So I feel humbled talking about this topic today, but it is important. And as you all know, most of you, I think that Sweden has championed this. It's not a surprise, perhaps, that Sweden was the champion of this initiative in now almost 7 years, 6.5 years back. And I would like to make this more of a discussion, actually, rather than a long presentation of what we've done. There are numerous examples, and I'll bring up a few, but I'd rather have an interactive session where we really can discuss. And it's really important for me also to, through this session today, understand the Indian perspectives on it, because when we look at the feminist foreign policy, yes, Sweden was the first one in 2014, and there are other countries that have adopted it, like France, Canada, and now Mexico very recently. But at the end of the day, it's whether the US, India, China, the biggies of the world, whether you adopt a feminist foreign policy, that's going to make the big difference. So it would be interesting to hear your perspectives on really what is the setting here, and how do you see the way forward for a country like India, for example. And I've served in India now for almost 9 years, 4 plus now 5 years. So I've got a fairly good perspective of your country as well. So it would be really interesting and valuable for me to hear the audience and hear you and your perspective on that. But if I start with just a brief presentation, and I have also with me today in the audience my colleague Jonathan, who's dealing with the feminist foreign policy at the embassy. He's responsible. He will be posting some links also where you can read up. The audience can look at the whole battery of examples of what we've been doing, so that I don't have to list them. But there is actually, after 6 years, quite a large evidence that the policy has been successful. And that wasn't really the case. I remember when it was instituted in 2014, I was among the skeptics. I really thought that what is this feminist foreign policy thing all about? It's just another slogan that they're bandying about, and what does it mean actually? But over the years, I've become a convert. And now also, since I've been here at the embassy in Delhi since 2016, I've also been able to practice it in the field. So I also can see my own journey in the feminist foreign policy, how I've been actually convinced that this is an extremely valuable, not only tool, it's an end in itself. You can justify feminist foreign policy and say it gives us more secure, more prosperous, more healthy societies because of women, but it is an end in itself to have these, as our foreign minister said, to put on the gender glasses, and once you put them on, you never take them off. And I think that's a great quote. So if we start, it was launched in 2014 by the then foreign minister Margot Wallström, and the reason is, of course, the status of gender equality in the world, and we can come back also to the pandemic and the effects it has had. But there are huge gaps, and we don't need to say give figures and talk about it, but the systematic subordination, oppression, and violence still marks the daily lives of so many women and girls around the world. We have binding conventions, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Istanbul Convention by the Council of Europe, etc., but they're not implemented properly. And we felt in Sweden a need to accelerate the work for gender equality across the world. So in 2014, the policy was launched, and it has 6 objectives: full enjoyment of human rights, for women and girls and women. Freedom from physical, psychological, and sexual violence. Participation in preventing and resolving conflicts and post-conflict peace building. And that's really an area where we have put in a lot of effort. Political participation and influence in all areas of society. Economic rights and empowerment. And sexual and reproductive health and rights. I could add a seventh objective, which has been internal, and that's really mainstreaming the feminist foreign policy in the government offices, and in particular in the foreign service of Sweden. There's been a lot of work going on from the start, how to sort of bring ownership so that people like myself who were skeptic actually took charge of the policy from the grassroots in the ministry. And there's a difference, as I said, between a feminist foreign policy and gender mainstreaming. I mean, gender has been discussed since Hillary Clinton spoke in Beijing in 1994, if I'm not wrong. But it's now a perspective. It's not an add-on, and it's really about internalizing this perspective within ourselves. And the three rights that Dnyanada mentioned, rights, representations, and resources, is really what we constantly look at when we work with the policy. There's a fourth one also, a fourth R, which is reality check. You could add that, I mean, the context is very different in the 100+ countries where the Swedish Foreign Service is active. And it's very important to contextualize the work that we do. And I think our embassies have been pretty good at finding the right context in the country where they are active. So you have to do a reality check and see, can you really move the discourse? Can you actually sort of move the needle? You have to constantly evaluate this policy to see, is it really making a difference? Because at the end of the day, if it's a paper tiger, it really won't have any effect. So if you look at representation, the first R, I mean, discrimination of women and girls, they lack representation and influence. Half of the population is missing in the absolute majority of peace processes, for example. So as I mentioned, this is one area, to give you one example of how we've been working in the Syrian and in Yemen peace process, mainly where Sweden has had a key role. There was absolutely no thought among the major stakeholders of women in that peace process. And since we were the mediator, we insisted on it and built up a network of female mediators and brought them into the process, because it has been proven that when women are involved in peace, in conflict resolution and peacemaking processes, the likelihood of peace being lasting increases by 35%. So there have been studies on this. It seems almost obvious, like many of these issues, but it's something that really has never been on the table before Sweden really pushed for it. Another area, then, the second R is resources. To match the global challenges and to cover the entire global agenda, we bring all our tools into play. So we try to look at resources in our development cooperation, in trade policy, for example. So we constantly evaluate our efforts and where we put our money, actually, to ensure that the gender perspective is included. That was also, now it seems obvious, but then even 6-7 years ago it wasn't. And I'm glad to say that this emphasis on resources really spread to other countries as well in their work. Representation is a third R. We also see that we've been pushing a lot for women participation in the political field. I mean, you know, probably that Sweden and some other countries have a 50-50 representation in parliament, in politics, voluntary such in Sweden, no quotas. But in our development cooperation, we have been using this, the representation as really putting pressure on our development partners to include women at all aspects, at all levels, from the top through boards and in parliaments to the grassroots. So I'll come back with some more examples on that. So if we come to what developments have we seen, then? I mean, we have seen an institutional cultural shift in our system. People like myself, middle-aged now, I mean, we did not grow up with this, but I can tell you that if you go to any Swedish Foreign Service officer today, they won't even have to think about the perspective when in the daily work. It's a given today. ambassadors and the heads of departments, etc., the first thing that comes up is how is the feminist foreign policy implemented in whatever we are undertaking. We've also inspired more countries, as I said. A few more countries have joined, and I know that several other countries might not call it a feminist foreign policy, but in practice, they have shifted the goalposts and are working with the same principles. We have a lot more ambassadors for gender equality. Sweden, as soon as we instituted this policy, we also created resources in the ministry. So we have an ambassador for feminist foreign policy with a small secretariat that acts as the sort of support function for us. A lot of countries have then subsequently adopted such or instituted such ambassadors. We have also more networks around the world. As I mentioned, women mediators in peace processes is one example, but there are several others. For example, we have many more women briefers in the United Nations Security Council, where Sweden was a member in 2017-18, where we really pushed gender equality. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we actually instituted a feminist trade policy as an add-on to the feminist foreign policy, so a specialized feminist trade policy in Sweden. I think we're the first country to do that as well, to specifically look at how we work with trade internationally. And Jonathan will be sending you a link where you can see, I mean, there are about 300 examples of practical things that we've been doing. In India, just to give you a flavor of what we have been doing, this embassy does not have any development cooperation anymore. We shut down that part in 2013. So our work in India is mainly focused on trade promotion, innovation, etc. But still, gender equality permeates the work of the embassy. And how we do it is that we have our yearly plans, and there's a requirement from Stockholm that when we draw up our yearly plans, that we from the start include proposal for how the feminist foreign policy should be carried out in our plans. Two concrete examples of how we're working and where we think we can make a change in a country like India is so huge is that first of all, we've been working very closely with the Swedish business community in India. There are about 220 companies present here, employing about 2 lakh Indians and maybe 1 or 2 million Indians, depending on how you count it, in the supplier chains. These companies are well-known global brands like IKEA, Ericsson, Volvo, Scania, and many others. And when we look at them, we have first of all engaged in a discussion through the Chamber of Commerce with them and actually asked them to give us their gender sort of key performance indicators, giving a baseline of where these companies are on gender. And we're just now going to initiate a project where we sort of take the next step on sharing best practices among the companies to see where the leaders among the Swedish companies can then spread their best practices to the other ones. For example, you have a company like IKEA, which has they have vowed to employ 50% women at all levels, from top management down to the shop floor. And we are looking at such good examples and to see how best practices can be sort of shared among the Swedish companies. So that's a way of working with a very concrete and practical way of working with the feminist foreign policy from an embassy point of view. Another way is to shift sort of perceptions is the Wikigap. I'm sure you know about the concept nowadays, but we launched it in our foreign ministry, and it was then spread all over the world, where we had in India several Wikigap exercises where we partnered together with some NGOs and had sort of hackathons where we edited and created Wikipedia content. As you know, 90% of all Wikipedia content created by men. 4 times more articles about men than women on Wikipedia. So we had editathons, and all over the world, we have now produced around 4,000 new articles trying to balance the gender perspective on Wikipedia. So that's another very practical measure. So I think that for us as practitioners in the field, this is not merely a policy tool. It infuses everything that we do. When we look at panels, when we look at interactions with the Indian government, we always insist on having women on board. And you know, it's sometimes very difficult in certain sectors and certain contexts in India to ensure that, but we try. So I would say that this foreign policy has really petered down through the organization, and the ownership has been extremely important, which I feel that we have succeeded. So I think that now we have had a midterm review of a year back or two of the policy. The government is giving more resources to it. It's proven successful. I think we're now concluding the second period of it, and probably we'll have to raise our ambition even more, because I think we need more resources. That's one key learning, that if you are going to implement such an ambitious policy, you also need resources to back it up. And I think that's where we can probably do better. Finally, I mean, in this initial, I really like your questions and reactions, but I would say that it's not unproblematic. I mean, the feminist foreign policy has been criticized from various quarters also as being a neoliberal tool for, just squeezing out more. It's an economistic in nature, seeing women as resources, and it's just a way of getting more efficiency and economic output from women. But as I said in the beginning, I do feel that, at least from the Swedish perspective, it is a goal in itself. We really believe in gender equality as a goal in itself, and all the other benefits come out of it. And finally, I'd like to say that the pandemic, which I mentioned in the beginning, pandemic has been tremendously hurtful for gender equality across the world. In India, even in Sweden, women have been in the sectors, have been mainly employed in some of the worst hit sectors, as you know, services sectors, in restaurants, hotels. Also they've been the first ones to lose their jobs. We see a radical shift downwards in participation in the labor force of women, just in a year. And I fear that it'll take a long time to repair this and get back, and it wasn't good even before. Just a quick example of how feminist foreign policy could have worked. We early on in the pandemic, as you remember, India shut down, and there has been a lot of debate in India, but the fact that sanitary pads were not deemed an essential good, and only afterwards, after a lot of lobbying and protests, there was some movement on this. But the fact is that production of STs was shut down in a laudable attempt to prevent the pandemic. It shows how much a gender perspective in government would have helped to really look at what would be the effects on women from policies. So I'm just leaving that on the table as a point of discussion to see what your perspective is on how India is placed on this also. But I would therefore stop now and welcome your questions.
Thank you for that primer, Gautam. It's been quite informative. We do have a couple of questions, and I have one of my own as well. As you rightly mentioned, you started out as a skeptic of feminist foreign policy. And eventually, obviously, once you saw it in action, you were converted to the cause. Can you describe maybe for us, because eventually, as you also mentioned before, it's for us to come up with ideas on how to be able to operationalize the feminist foreign policy in India. So can you describe maybe a couple of criticisms that not just feminist foreign policy faced on a theoretical level, but maybe some major challenges that were faced in operationalizing it within the Swedish Foreign Services, because that would help give us an example of, what is the kind of path that any country that wants to operationalize this wants to traverse.
Thank you. Dnyanada, your connection is quite bad, so I mean it's a bit garbled. It came a little garbled to my ears at least, but I think I got your question. So if you look at challenges and practical challenges for this and obstacles in operationalizing it, we didn't really face any challenges, I would say, because it came from the top. If it comes from the top, everything else falls in place, as it is in big organizations. If your prime minister or your foreign minister would say, I want a feminist foreign policy or a gender equal, you don't have to call it feminist, a gender equal foreign policy to be operationalized, it will happen. So let's face it, people work in hierarchies, and if the top person does it, then a lot has been won already. The second, I think, obstacle that was overcome was what I mentioned, is that early on we had workshops where people were invited from the whole organization to come up with ideas on what is a feminist foreign policy. So we weren't served a template. We weren't served a ready menu. If you look at it in the beginning, it was quite thin. Thence my skepticism in the beginning. I just saw a slogan. But then they asked us to come up with ideas. They invited us for a series of workshops. We could send suggestions online, etc. It was really a free for all, and I think that really unlocked the process from the beginning to make it inclusive across the ministry, so everybody could contribute. And then what they did is they early on started heroing people who did something. So when we did our Wikigap exercise, it's a small thing, you may say, but it was picked up and done across the whole ministry in various countries, and we felt immensely proud that we kicked off this thing in India. So I mean, that's also, I mean, it paid off to be a warrior for this cause. And so there are several things that you need to put in place, I think, to get it operationalized. I don't know if that answers your question.
It certainly does. I hope you can hear me better now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we do have a question that's kind of related. It basically says, before countries move towards the FFP framework, the language used and attitude that politicians have towards women and other genders has to be addressed. Does the FFP address this? And how can it be addressed across various geographies in the world?
Okay, I think I missed the first part of it. Can you repeat?
Does the FFP address the language used and the attitude that politicians have towards women and other genders? And the last part is, how can this be addressed across various geographies in the world?
Yes, it does address it. I mean, for example, it's sometimes a question of terminology. Some countries in the world, and I won't mention them here, but even within Europe, we have had quite tough debates with some of our colleague member states within the European Union on language concerning sexual reproductive rights, health and rights, rights and health. And for example, the word gender equality is something that we constantly push for, so that it's not converted into women or girls or something. We want it to be gender equality and nothing else. So there's a lot of discussion and quite often quite tough debates on which language to use in European Union, for example, within the European Union. So yes, I mean, we try to influence the language. And then I think that it's not always easy. Of course, we deal with countries as a foreign service. We deal with countries with very, very, very different perspectives on gender equality. Some of them actually actively work against gender equality and have it as their theological sort of, it's inscribed in their theology of the country. Again, I won't mention them, but we do business with such countries. And then how do you act? So I think that it's as a diplomat, you have to balance. You have to be very, very subtle. But I think that what we do is that we always mention gender equality in any engagement. And some countries are more susceptible to pick it up, some less. But I would say that the mere fact that we always harp on it, it's like waking up in the middle of the night and someone gives you a text and you say, where is gender equality? So anything we do, we just have to put it in and see. So I think that has an effect. It has an effect. It spreads. It does affect our partners, and it does slowly erode any resistance against talking about gender equality in various, like security, for example. Gender equality was not a factor in security a few years back. I think that we have been able to push the envelope there.
That is true. I think repetition does help get the point across eventually. Our next question is, how is Sweden's FFP tied to the Unsc resolution 1325?
1325? Yeah, so I mean, we were in the Security Council for 2 years, as I said, and I think that's where we really put in our main thrust, because the especially the permanent members of the Security Council and some of the others were not really geared toward this. So I would say that our main achievement on 1325 has been through our 2 years in the Security Council, where we really got that the gender perspective included much more in conflict resolution through the Security Council. I think I mentioned Yemen, Syria. Some of these conflicts, we really have made a difference and been able to include women and get the 3 Rs on board. So if you want a concrete example, I think the Yemen conflict is the one that I have on top of mind. But of course, we've been working with 1325 from the very beginning. The point is that a lot of countries have signed up, but But the question is, how do countries implement them? So that's really where we need to work much more on engaging different countries and seeing how are you implementing it. It's one thing to sign up, but the other thing is how do you implement it?
True. I think implementation happens to be the biggest challenge for any policy whatsoever. Our next question is on what are the challenges that you see that feminist foreign policy might face as it becomes contextualized, specifically at the confluence of human rights and women's rights in certain countries?
Yeah, sorry again. Really, I'm really sorry, Dnyanada. Yeah.
Should I repeat that?
Maybe it's just my computer. Yes,
Should I
please.
repeat that? Yeah.
Actually, I think if you have the earphones or something, your voice
I'm
is
not
cracking.
using earphones.
Okay.
Because if I do, then it'll be worse.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I can also check the chat. I understand my colleague just told me we have the questions in the chat. I'll just scroll up. Let me just see. Okay, sorry, which was the question now? There was
the one that ends with, what are the challenges do you see feminist foreign policy would face as it becomes contextualized? And this is specifically...
Yeah, okay, yeah. Now my computer is acting up. Has to be flexible, considering it about others, dealing with alien societies. Yes, as I said, they have a different social cultural ethos. That's where democratic rights are challenged with the common human rights and women's rights in some countries. What are the challenges you see for feminist foreign policy would face as it becomes contextualized? Well, yes, I mean, there will always be the temptation to relativize human rights and relativize gender equality, saying that our culture, yes, this is all fine, but in our culture, women are supposed to X, Y, and Z. And I'm fine with I think that it's very, very dangerous to become a preacher and go and tell everybody you should do it our way. I'm not saying that at all. I think countries across the world need to find their own context. They need to do it in a way that hopefully brings as many stakeholders on board without becoming confrontational. They will have to face various forces from various quarters that might not be geared toward this, and they have to win them over in such countries. So I'm not saying that it's a template that can be translated, but I think that one very important thing is to start out early with the people who are objecting, who might potentially be objecting to this prima facie. But when you sit down and talk to them about education, about access, etc., they will perhaps not be objecting as much as they will be politically or on the face of it. So I think that to engage very early with stakeholders, including the troublesome ones, I mean, given that they're not violent or radical or at least you can talk to them. I think that that's a key. Don't just talk to the converted, the already converted, the people who are already the NGOs and civil society. I think you need to tackle the religious forces. You need to tackle some of the conservative quarters immediately and say that we're not after your religion. We're not after your this or that. This is not a threat. This is actually empowering your constituencies as well. It's empowering the country. It's empowering half of the country. So I think that I'm not saying that I'm not blue-eyed in the sense that I think that you can win over all of them, but I think you can really make a few of them understand what it is you're doing and get less opposition, at least, for some of the initiatives. So that would be my take, that you need to engage and talk to some of the conservative forces in society who see this as a threat. How do you do that? I think that's contextual.
Maybe I could read out, Gautam, one of the questions which I found very interesting, because Moira, she is from Philippines, and she's also, I know, that served in the diplomatic services of Philippines. So she's talking about while it is not explicitly stated as a feminist foreign policy goal, a major priority in Philippines foreign policy is about the issues related to migration and the protection of the rights of welfare of migrants, as women are a majority of migrants, Filipino migrants working overseas. So she's talking about I think what could be, I think she's talking about different resolutions also. In
Mm.
countries like Philippines, and I think a lot of these countries, what could be the lessons learned on foreign policy, I guess, feminist foreign policy, when they are trying to implement it? Because a lot of their women also work as migrants.
Very interesting. Really interesting to see. Of course, Philippines. I think some countries like Philippines and in South Asia, Sri Lanka and others have been known to have higher or larger representation of women. But this migration perspective is quite interesting from the Philippines. We've been working a lot with migration and especially the fact that women and girls are so vulnerable when it comes to international migration, also trafficking issues, but also migration related to climate change or to conflict. So we're working a lot with the feminist foreign policy in that field, and I've been trying to bring in the perspectives there. But it's interesting to see the Philippine. I didn't know about the Philippines. As I said, it's not just those 4 countries which have feminist foreign policy. I think many countries are working with issues in their own way. So you don't have to call it a feminist foreign policy. The important thing is you do something.
Dnyanada, over to you. I just wanted to ask this question, I guess.
No worries at all. So there is one question that I wanted to bring to your attention. Are there benchmarks or parameters used to measure how the FFP has affected gender equality on the ground? Have there been measurable differences seen since FFP's inception in Sweden?
Yes, I think that yes, there are benchmarks, and it's a bit perhaps I should not go into each detail, but I think there are benchmarks and parameters of how female participation has shifted in for example, representation in how many women are in the decision-making fora, for example, in our development corporations. There are benchmarks that have been developed. I think we need to strengthen that probably. As far as I know, and Jonathan, who's here with me, my colleague, might know more about it since he's working with the issues day to day. But I think we should be working more on bringing forth a sort of an index that can be more easily presented. I think it's scattered information. So I think that that's something I'll actually take back. I'm not 100% sure, I should say, but I think that there's a need to probably consolidate that information. But yes, there are benchmarks in various fields where we've been looking and analyzing at, have we been able to push the representation and the resources for women in various, especially development cooperation, I would say. I mean, in Sweden, if you come to the internal side, I would say that it hasn't really made a huge difference within the foreign ministry. We already have about 50%, as the Philippines, we have about 50% female and male managers and ambassadors across levels. There's a slight male predominance still, I think, in ambassadors, but there are more females at home, heads of departments. So I think we're overall fairly evenly placed. And in fact, there are more women now in the diplomatic recruitment program every year in the batch. There've been I've been actually, I was in the HR department for 3 years, and I saw how women actually, we got better female candidates and more female candidates, and men are slowly being edged out because of the study results and the fact that women are going ahead. I think this is a phenomenon worldwide. Women are performing better academically, and we therefore see actually a slant towards women in our recruitment.
There's one other interesting question which cites the gender gap report by the World Economic Forum and India's poor performance on it. So the question goes, what are the policy changes that India can embark on to close the prevailing gender gap? And what policy examples can India learn of from the Swedish foreign policy?
Well, it's not for me to advise the Indian government, but to inspire. I think that it is probably a very good thing, a very good idea to try to put in some kind of gender equality framework, whether you call it feminist or not. But I would really be very keen, and I think we would be very happy to work with the Indian government if such a discussion or dialogue came about. So that I think it really starts. It has to start from the policy and from the decision makers. So that's one for the Indian government in general. I mean, I know that there are a lot of initiatives going on in India. Again, India never suffers good policies. It's the question of implementation, as we all know. And I see movement. I see honestly that there have been taken a lot of steps in India, but it's always the question of implementing it all the way, and especially when there's a crunch like the pandemic, then you tend to sort of retrench and go back to safe. The man will have the employment, the woman takes a step back, etc. It's also a question of how comfortable the decision makers feel. If they are very hard pressed, if there's an economic crisis, it becomes more difficult for them. So I would say that there's a need probably for such a discussion in India, in the government, how to more systematically implement the gender perspective. But I would not, I mean, I know many of you are experts in your field. I would be very amiss to give you advice on that, really. I see the need, and I hope that maybe a decentralized approach could be something that could prove valuable in India, that you try it out in some district or some state and then you scale it up. So I hope that decentralization in India would also be good for the gender perspective.
Another very interesting question, and this is again on data somewhat. Books like Invisible Women have highlighted how women are routinely left out of medical studies, algorithms, safety measures, urban planning, and a lot of other subjects. Has Sweden been able to work on such issues of data bias via its conduct of FFP?
I mean, yes, in Sweden, of course, we've been working a lot on such bias, and again, there's lots to be done in Sweden as well. Let's face it. We'll come back to that. But if you look at various sectors in Sweden, I think the public sector is better performing. It's better in this aspect. But if you look at the private sector, there are huge gaps still and a huge underrepresentation of women, especially in higher positions. So yes, there has been a lot of work in Sweden on data bias, and I would dare to say that when we now undertake any sort of public initiative in Sweden, it is always looking at the figures and looking at it from a gender perspective. I think it's so mainstreamed at this point that you don't even have to really bring it up today in public planning in Sweden. I think abroad, our foreign feminist policy, mainly, as I said, it's in our development cooperation where we've been able to make a difference. So when we, as you know, we are quite a big donor. We have this commitment to the 1% of GDP goal, and that among few countries in the world, and so we are a large donor, and especially in Africa, which is our focus region. I think that we, not being an expert in the field, not having worked in Africa, but what I've seen from the development cooperation side is that they have actually addressed the issue of statistics and data bias from the beginning when they designed their projects. So yes, we are working with it in a very systematic way. And that's really a scope. I would really think India is also emerging as a big donor in Afghanistan and other countries in Africa. I see a lot of scope where we could sort of share best practices, and where it's a fairly, I would say, it's a safe area to collaborate. And I think where India also perhaps would benefit maybe in looking at gender in its development cooperation. So that's an area I see a lot of scope for if we could begin collaboration on that.
Absolutely.
Jonathan, you can also add something if Jonathan has something to add. He's the expert in the field. So if you want more detailed answers.
If Jonathan has any comments, please go ahead.
Sure. I was actually just about to write something in the chat there. So it was concerning within peace and security and its connection to our feminist foreign policy. As Gautam mentioned, our 2 years in the UN Security Council was an excellent opportunity to kind of well, basically lift these issues, and the role for women in the entire cycle of conflict is obviously very relevant. So there is connections to that. The feminist foreign policy is a concept which should permeate different themes of our foreign policy. It's partly in feminist trade policy. It's about having a perspective of gender equality in our development aid. Security policy is obviously connected to the VPS. So it's basically finding a way to permeate this perspective in the different fields, and ultimately it's also about changing the structures and norms that have allowed these injustices to continue. So it's a broad theme, and I really enjoy that we have this discussion because it gives us the opportunity to explain it a bit more, because it's very easy to get stuck in the idea of it being a cliche or something to the likes of that. And I really appreciate that you take this time to also pose all these different questions, which allows us to kind of explain the complexity and the idea, which is not very easy to understand, but to us it's very important, and it's something that we, or at least I specifically work with every day to see how we can make it work, also given our local context here. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I do have one other question in the chat, which I would like to bring to your attention. It goes, Sweden has in the past been criticized for its arms export. Considering it is contradictory to the ideals of a feminist foreign policy, how do you think Sweden needs to balance the two?
Gautam, we are not able to hear. Sorry. You might be on mute. Sorry. The system mute.
Can't hear you, Gautam.
Hello.
There it is.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hi everyone, can you hear me on this?
Yes.
Okay, then I will hand over my phone to Gautam and we will do it from there.
Okay. Hi, sorry about the technical snag. I muted the phone and computer and couldn't come back online again.
No.
The arms question. Yes, Sweden is a major arms exporter, and we including to India. Yeah, nobody likes arms at the end of the day, not even the people who work with it. I can tell you at the end of the day, they don't like the fact that the weapons are used to kill. Sweden has tightened its export framework in the past, even the past decade. We've seen a steady tightening on. We already had a democracy criterion, but it's been tightened. So the number of countries to which we can export have been actually reduced. And I think that really sets us apart from many other arms exporters, including in the West, who do not have such strict democracy criteria. So the regime to which we export, we try to be ensure that it's as democratic as possible. In the past, we have not been as strict. So yes, there's a legacy. So that's one area you can say where we're trying to become more responsible. It's not an easy thing, and it's a debate in Sweden as well. We have a very lively debate on the fact that you on the one hand export arms, and on the other hand you talk about peace in the world. But we, at the end of the day, are a country. We have powerful neighbors. We have, as you know, during the Cold War, we were squeezed between the two. We were neutral. We built up a huge defense force with the world's 4th largest air force at one point. And still today there are actors in the European region who perhaps are not really conducive to stability and harmony and peace, invading neighboring countries, and I won't mention the countries, but we have, of course, our own security interests to take care of, like all countries. So it is important for Sweden to have an industry, an arms industry, and defense material, but it is with an emphasis on defense. So again, we've been working quite a lot in the international forum, small arms, for example, trying to restrict the export of small arms. So we are trying in our own way. With again, it's not completely possible to bridge all these contradictions, but we are trying in our own way to at least restrict the spread of nefarious weapons around the world, and trying to restrict ourselves so that the weapons don't end up in the wrong hands. So that's my answer to it.
I quite agree. I mean, being in defense economics myself and in a specific advisory capacity, there is a very difficult balance that has to be struck. I mean, but I think we can take one last question. And it basically goes, do international relations studies in Sweden motivate studies on feminist IR?
Dnyanada, I also wanted to point out there are two questions pending up. One is mine, so I thought I'll highlight, and one is by Dr. Alvite. So those are two questions pending. If we could take those two. I think Gautam's having. Sorry, everyone. Always the technical aspects when we do Zoom sessions gives us. Okay, we have. I think.
Okay.
This is like you get. Okay, let's see if we can do. Sorry about this technical. We're supposed to be a technically advanced country, and Skype was a Swedish invention and Ericsson, but apparently we're not as good as we think. Sorry, there were two pending questions.
Yes, there are. I'll read both of them out, and then you can decide how you want to answer them. Given the entrenched patriarchal setup in the South Asian region, what, according to you, are the fundamental roadblocks towards any initiatives to build up a feminist foreign policy approach? That's one. So that's one. And then the last question is the fact that you spoke about Yemen and Syria and the fact that Afghanistan is still within a peace process phase. How can women's participation in peace processes be increased in conflict zones? So both of these questions.
Let me start with Afghanistan first, because as I said, Yemen is a good example. I think that the Taliban will not be very keen on having women in the tent, so to speak. We understand that. There's no question about it. But I think there it's up to the external actors who have a place, including India, at the table. And now that India has been invited to be in the core group, I think I don't see Iran pushing women's participation in the process. I don't see many of the other countries doing it. Maybe India needs to push it. Sweden has a long, and Afghanistan is our biggest development cooperation country, actually, and the biggest in Asia. We have a huge program there. We've been there on the ground for 20 years, supporting mainly, education for girls and women, and through the Swedish Afghanistan committees. We have a huge commitment, like India, to the peace in Afghanistan. But we're not at the big table with the big boys, and you are. So I would really try to exhort you to through your contacts, make sure that women are brought into the tent, so to speak. But it has been proven that, as I said, a peace has 35% more chance of being lasting 15 years after any peace agreement. The studies have shown, if women are involved from the beginning in the peace and reconciliation process. So I'm too old to be hopeful. Very hopeful about Afghanistan. I've seen too much. I think I'm rather afraid that the country will slip back into civil war again. We can only hope. We can only hope, and I'm afraid women will be the biggest losers. So I just hope that some of the bigger actors will bring in this perspective, and I think that we in Kabul, through our embassy, are pushing this through our feminist foreign policy in our interactions with the Afghan government, with others. So we are working on it there. But more people need to step up and make their voices heard. The other question was very wide-ranging: how to overcome deep-rooted patriarchal mindsets. Yes, good question. Well, as I said, it doesn't go just for South Asia. It might be more deep-rooted here, or Sweden. Women didn't have voting rights. I think we're celebrating the 100 years of women being able to vote in Sweden. It's not that we 100, 200 years ago were a paragon of equality. We were not. Okay, the Viking women actually were more empowered because the husbands were out raiding and trading. And therefore, Sweden has a long tradition of women being in charge of the keys of the farm, which actually is a interesting historical perspective. But by no means have we arrived at the point where we are today without a fight, with a long fight. I think the key lies in people like myself, with the chromosome setup of me being a man. It's really about getting the men on board. It's not about women. This is not an issue for women, about women. We must make sure that men internalize it and become as
fierce champions for equality, because it's in all our interests. And unless you really, in families from childhood, instill these values, we won't be able to make a difference. But I see a lot of hope in India. I see young people in India. I see young couples, including my own family and so on. It's a completely different ballgame today when you raise kids in India. It's not ideal. And I would have to share with you that even in Sweden today, 60% of the household work is done by women, unpaid household work, 60 or 65. And when it comes to washing, it's 80%. They've done studies on various chores at home. So washing clothes, women are doing 80% of the washing of the clothes. So you can see we have a long way to go, even in Sweden. So I can only say that I think the key lies with men. If we can get men on board together in a project, so it doesn't become a fight, it becomes a collective effort of all of us, for ourselves, for our families, to understand this. That's the only way.
Pallavi, do we have time for one last question?
Sure, we can do that, yeah.
So we have one last question which asks, do international relations studies in Sweden motivate studies on feminist IR?
Sorry, Jonathan, you will have to thank the phone password.
Oh. Hello. Hi. Sorry. We're back here again. Sorry, let's see if we can hear you. So, do international relations studies in Sweden motivate studies on feminist international relations? Also, kindly mention if there are opportunities for Indian students to pursue PhD on topics of feminist international relations. So that's a very good question, and I remember not it wasn't that many years ago that I was in Sweden studying international relations. So I guess that's why the question came my way. No, definitely that perspective was part of the political science in the bachelor's degree, the different types of feminism. I'm not going to dare to mention all of them, because then I might miss some of them, but the kind of, and you know about this kind of, well, the literature and the academic field of gender equality, feminism within international relationship, within political science generally, I would say. Is definitely there. It could depend on the institution, the university that you actually study on, obviously. But we also studied welfare politics and other themes that always kind of took in this perspective of gender equality. So I think that it definitely includes that perspective a lot of times. But at the same time, it depends on the institution and the university and the teacher at the end of the day. But also in terms of academics, it's interesting to see who the researchers and the scholars that we read, that there's also kind of an idea of equaling out a little bit. There used to be a lot of male professors and so on, and that has changed a little bit too, also in terms of the readings that we do, but also the lecturers and the people that teach at the university. So it's definitely a perspective that's there, and that's growing within the universities, I would say, from my personal experience. When it came to the second question, that was the part on PhD students being able to pursue international relations with this focus in Sweden. I don't have the exact details of what course that would be, but there are definitely opportunities for Indian students to study in Sweden, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to higher education, PhD programs. And there are a willingness to pursue topics of this theme. So I would say, without promising too much at this point, I would say that it seems to be a possibility.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pallavi, would you like to close out the session?
I am going to give it to Stress.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Stress.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Gautam, for sharing your thoughts on the idea of feminist foreign policy. And thank you so much, Dnyanada, for keeping this session engaging, beside all those technical difficulties from all our sides. I think, and I think everybody who joined us would agree that the session is very interesting and fascinating session. And what Gautam said about empowering half of the world is the dire need of today's time. And I agree with him, and I think everybody will agree with that, that empowerment, I think that too should not be forced, but should evolve within the society, and everybody should be on board for that purpose. And I think idea of feminist foreign policy would be one of the stepping stone in that direction. And I think I would be I think that the countries like here in South Asia, they will think about this particular idea in near future very closely and start acting on this idea particularly. And further, India Sweden relation will grow on this particular idea also of conducting feminist foreign policy. So thank you so much, Gautam, for sharing your thoughts on this and Sweden's experience on the feminist foreign policy. And thank you so much all for your fascinating questions actually. And I think that too kept this session very much engaging. And with this, we are ending our month-long discussion on the empowerment of women and feminist feminism, and how we should empower women, like as Gautam said, half of the world. So with this, and next week we will have a discussion on left-wing extremism and in today's India. And further, as Pallavi said, next to next Saturday, we have Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon speaking on India's neighborhood first policy. So please join us for these sessions, and looking forward to see you all. And thank you so much, Jonathan, as well, for all your cooperation. So thank you, and have a great weekend, all of you. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. Take care.
Bye. Bye.